Ricky Nelson was considered broke by everyone when he perished in that plane disaster in 1985. He spent $1 million on his divorce. Everywhere he went, he owed money. His children will soon inherit nothing but debt. And then his brother discovered a will stashed somewhere. Additionally, attorneys found something startling. He has been cheated by record labels for decades. The subsequent events made his 4 children rich. The judge couldn't comprehend the size of the settlement figures. However, one son received nothing. Why will leave you speechless? Born on May 8, 1940, in Teaneck, New Jersey, Ricky Nelson was no ordinary child. Ozzie Nelson, his father, was a large band leader. His mom, Harriet Hilliard, had already acted in films. The world knew about Ricky's life from the start. His family's radio program, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, was already well known throughout America when he was still in diapers. Ricky grew raised in recording studios and soundstages rather than a peaceful suburb. Dinners with the family could become rehearsals. Occasionally, vacations become scripts. Everything felt staged, even the everyday interactions, as if you were living in a constant spotlight. Alongside his brother David, Ricky began the radio show in 1949 when he was only 8 years old. While the majority of guys his age were riding bikes or trading baseball cards, Ricky was cashing paychecks and learning lines. It was before he reached double digits that he became a star. His natural delivery was well received by audiences, and he was already well known by the age of 10. However, stardom has a cost. There were no sports teams or class birthday celebrations. Only lights, cameras, and accountability. Ricky was never truly a child. He used a studio as a playground. In many respects, his early years were given up for the family business. The family relocated to Los Angeles in 1941 and took up residence in a quaint green and white Cape Cod colonial at 1822 Camino Palmero. Not just a house, though. The American television industry adopted it as its face. It was featured in innumerable episodes of the program, making it one of the most recognizable houses in popular culture. Admirers even drove by to catch a glimpse. But there was a business going on inside those walls. There were scripts written. The living room was where the rehearsals took place. Ozzie managed the business like a tight ship, and the children were crew members. They couldn't separate their on-screen personas from their real lives. Ricky found it difficult to distinguish between fact and fantasy, despite the show's enormous success. What was merely for show and what was genuine? Ricky also had severe asthma symptoms. There were more than sporadic coughing episodes. It prevented him from going to school, from seeing friends, and occasionally from breathing simply to cross a room. Ricky stayed inside and read while the other children played. Or enjoying some music. It made him silent and reflective. He did more observing than talking. Later on, his soft-spoken side would contribute to his charm. He stood out due to his calm ferocity on screen. However, a lonely child was attempting to breathe and feel normal behind it. In 1944, Ozzie and Harriet hired actors to play their boys on the radio show. However, Ricky and David pushed for it because they didn't like that and wanted to play themselves. They were starring on the show as themselves by 1949. It has never actually been done like this before. Real family life was mixed with amusement in an odd way, and it worked. People became enamored with the Nelsons, and their ratings increased. Ricky was more than a character. Every single day he was living it. Fans were enthralled with his genuine life, which was made public knowledge. The first reality family in America was this one. That formed a genre decades before. 1957 then arrived. At the age of 17, Ricky sang on Walkin' by Fats Domino on the family's television program. It was electric. America's girls fell in love. They sold more than 1 million copies of the singles. He instantly became the epitome of adolescent cool. However, Ricky's life was already taking a much more mature turn off-screen. Girls, parties, and fast automobiles. Every door was unlocked by fame, and Ricky entered each one. During interviews, he was kind yet rebellious behind the scenes. He was attractive but crazy. He slicked his hair back and began to grow out his sideburns. Little disobediences irritated his parents, who yet desired to maintain authority. His debut single with Imperial Records, Bebop Baby, made history later that year. 750,000 advance orders were placed before it ever reached the stores. When it did, it hit the top 5 on the pop and R&B charts and quickly surpassed 1 million copies. Ricky was now a major player, not simply a teenage idol. Ricky, his debut album, was the #1 album. Being young and attractive suddenly meant more than just being cute, it meant having money. Ricky demonstrated that it was effective for record labels to see dollar signs in every teen with a guitar. Intense relationships were also being formed by Ricky, some of which would have surprised his admirers if they had known. One was with Marianne Gaba, who portrayed his lover on television. The scene was sultry off-screen. Ricky later acknowledged that they would neck for hours, which was a scandal waiting to happen in the 1950s. He even presented her with a gold ring that read, "To marry and love Rick." It meant they were serious, she thought. He did not. The singer Lori Collins was one of the girls Ricky was already seeing, and he began writing music with her. He was spotless in the eyes of the people. Little people realized the truth, though, as the actual Ricky was a fast-paced adolescent. His parents were really uneasy about all of this. Not only were Ozzy and Harriet parents, they were gatekeepers, producers, and managers. They detested Ricky's numerous girlfriends. They believed love would distract him. Ozzy in particular was severe. By the time Ricky was in his mid-teens, he was earning $500 a week, but his father kept the money. Ricky's allowance was meager. He was not to be spoiled, according to his father. He also had control over his personal life. There were no engagement rumors. Relationships that were serious were discouraged. But being accustomed to the spotlight and the strain, Ricky started to rebel. Parties late at night and secret girlfriends. America's favorite TV family still had him as its face. However, he was eluding their authority behind the scenes. At the age of 17, Ricky Nelson's debut record became a #1 success. The album, which was simply called Ricky, was released in October 1957. It quickly dominated the charts and spent 2 weeks at the top of the Billboard LP chart. At that time, he was the youngest artist to accomplish so. It wasn't just a teenager singing catchy songs, either. The Adventures of Ozzy and Harriet, one of the most popular television programs in America, had already made Ricky a household name. Millions of people watched him sing and act every week. The living room and the airways were dominated by Ricky, while other celebrities, such as Elvis, controlled the radio. Bebop Baby and Have I Told You Lately That I Love You are two examples of such songs. Were already making inroads into the charts prior to the album's release. His achievement was the result of a method, not a chance. Ozzy Nelson, his father, was the mastermind behind that method. Ozzy recognized a chance that no one else had as producer of their family's television program. Every episode concluded with Ricky performing a brand new song. This was not only adorable, it was brilliant. 10 million viewers were watching weekly. It was a huge exposure. In April 1957, Ricky's performance of I'm Walkin' on the Show caused the song to soar to #4 on the charts. The romanticism of a teenager, its B-side, rose even further to #2. There had never been an impact like it. Ricky's songs were woven into the plot by Ozzy, who also tightly controlled Ricky's appearances. Even the Ed Sullivan Show was off limits to him. Why should they share the limelight when they could have it all to themselves? Poor Little Fool followed. The song became the first to ever reach the top of Billboard's newly created Hot 100 chart in August 1958. It would have been history on its own, but there's more. The song was composed by Sharon Sheeley, a 15-year-old girl. Ricky took a video. Reluctantly. Even though it wasn't intended to be a single, radio stations adored it. Despite Ricky's objections, Imperial Records went ahead and released it. It quickly rose to the top of the charts, remained there for 2 weeks, and then made its way into the country and R&B charts. Ricky's legacy in music was permanently solidified at that moment. It continues to bring in money for his estate. Many people have covered the song. However, no other person can ever rank first on the Hot 100. That's Ricky's lifelong title. In the years 1957 to 1962, Ricky had 20 songs in the top 40. During that period, only Elvis had more. He sold more than 1 million copies of Bebop Baby, his debut single with Imperial Records. It had 750,000 pre-orders before it was even released. The same was true of his contract. complete control over his music and album artwork, along with a 5-year guarantee of $50,000. It was unprecedented for a teenager. Nor did the revenue from those hits cease to flow. His records were continuously promoted on TV. There were 9,000 chapters of the Ricky Nelson International Fan Club worldwide by 1960. Not only was Ricky wealthy, he was well known. He demonstrated his ability to act in 1959. Alongside Dean Martin and John Wayne, he starred in Rio Bravo. As Colorado Ryan, he was nominated for a Golden Globe for Most Promising Newcomer. Although his performance was commended, there remained more to see. His expenditure. Ricky led a lavish life. VIP clubs, expensive vehicles, and custom suits. His relationship with Hollywood's elite was profound. He reportedly received a $5,000 allowance each month, which, in today's currency, is about $50,000. In addition to helping his career, that role exposed his liking for luxury. Not only did fame bring him money, but it also changed him. Ironically, Sam Cooke rejected 1961's Travelin' Man, one of his greatest songs, first. It did not seem to fit him. Ricky risked it and showed everyone that they were mistaken. The song sold over 1 million copies in a few weeks after peaking at number 1 in April. Hello Mary Lou, the B-side, was also successful. On one record, there are 2 huge hits. Songs that others overlooked were picked up by Ricky. One of the final significant victories before everything changed was this one. In the background, he was growing impatient. His records featured older session musicians who didn't value rock and roll. Some wouldn't play the way he desired. He was even told, "Kid, this isn't music." Thus, Ricky dismissed them. He assembled a band of young musicians that shared his vision for the sound he was pursuing. Pay, equipment, and travel expenses were high, but he gained control. James Burton was one of those new band members who would later become a legend in his own right. Sound wasn't the only factor here. It has to do with respect. Ricky was tired of being handled like a puppet, but there was nothing that could be done to stop what happened next. The Beatles were a tidal wave to America in 1964. Everything changed in February when they appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. They were in the top 5 on the Billboard chart by April. Elvis fought. Everybody else did, too. This also applied to Ricky. His song For You nearly cracked the top 40 that year. There was a lapse in the spell. Not only did the British invasion introduce new music, but it also changed the regulations. On Christmas Day 1961, Rick Nelson, who was already a well-known musician, met 16-year-old Chris Harmon. He was 21 years old. The actress Elise Knox and football great Tom Harmon were her parents, and she was the sister of future television personality Mark Harmon. On paper, they appeared to be the ideal Hollywood pair. Renowned, alluring, and elevated in the public eye. That dream, however, became a protracted nightmare. Rick had been under pressure from the start. His funds were managed by his father, Ozzie. Having grown up in affluence, Chris desired a life of luxury. The spending continued despite Rick's best efforts to keep up. Year after year, his bank account was emptied by homes, automobiles, fancy clothing, and far-flung trips. Rick had lost everything by the late 1970s. The fairy tale was over. Their marriage, which took place on April 20, 1963, was not very romantic. The wedding was a shotgun affair. The hurried ceremony was demanded by her Catholic parents, and Chris was already expecting. Rick, who wasn't Catholic, was had to formally swear to raise their children in the faith. He had no say in the matter. They made a demand. To keep the peace, he had to attend Catholic classes and follow the procedures. In reality, the wedding was about control, pressure, and putting on a show for the world, even though it was intended to be a celebration. No pressure ever built up. It's odd that Rick's parents adored Chris. She had been rejected, but all the other girls he had dated had been. They were overjoyed to connect the Harmon and Nelson families. Classy, well-connected, and descended from Hollywood royalty, Chris had the perfect image. Although it appeared to be a great fit, the illusion quickly vanished. Rick had always complied with his father's strict financial regulations, but suddenly his wife wanted all that money could buy. They failed to budget. They simply wasted money. In the mid-1970s, Rick's career cooled off, but the bills didn't. More than ever, Chris wanted him home. Rick needed to continue his tour. Both financially and emotionally, he was overburdened. The once impressive marriage ended with a $1 million legal bill. Chris even went on Ozzie and Harriet's escapades with Rick after they were married. On the show, she portrayed herself and earned money for herself. However, 2 paychecks simply meant more money spent. They were both clueless on how to save. Agents, aides, and accountants were all about them. However, the bleeding continued. Unchecked. Rick, who had previously complied with his father's stringent financial regulations, was now wasting everything to maintain the way of life. Chris began to withdraw because he felt stuck in a phony TV world and his marriage was failing. They had gone too far by then. The Hollywood dream devolved into a financial meltdown. Rick and Chris collaborated on the film Love and Kisses in 1965. His dad was the director. 2 adolescents elope and struggle to live with the groom's parents in the novel. The truth was grim, despite the humorous storyline. Their work already showed the effects of their personal issues. It was regarded by critics as inspired casting. However, none recognized the film's personal resonance. Despite being 25, he played a high school student. Chris's performance was not well received. Their marriage was failing in the background. Ozzie presented personal drama on screen in a way that was more distressing than amusing, using the movie to play out private difficulties. It was prophetic, embarrassing, and uneasy. By 1969, Rick was itching to get away from the past. He reinvented himself by combining rock and country music before it was popular by forming the Stone Canyon Band. Randy Meisner, who would eventually join the Eagles, was recruited by him. Although the timing was poor, the band showed potential. Rick transitioned from being the main act at large venues to playing in small bars for meager pay. Meisner resigned because he felt stuck and wasn't earning any money. Despite being innovative, the albums Rick Sings Nelson and In Concert were not well received. As Rick's fame and fortune disappeared, he pursued artistic freedom. He was prepared to pay any price to establish himself as a serious musician. It almost did. Then it happened, the moment that broke him. October 15, 1971. An amazing rock and roll show at Madison Square Garden. When Rick arrived expecting love, he was jeered. In an attempt to try a new sound, he dropped the Y from Ricky. Honky-tonk chicks was his genre. The old hits were what the crowd wanted. Some claimed the music wasn't the main attraction. They blamed the crowd on police action. Rick, though, thought the message was obvious. The new him was not what they wanted. Disgraced, he walked off stage and stayed backstage to witness the remainder of the performance. Finally, he was persuaded to return and perform the classics. When the crowd eventually cheered, the harm was already done. He was broken by that night. A surprise, however, emerged from that catastrophe. Garden Party was written by Rick in 1972. It had a personal touch. It was unfiltered. It was real. The chorus said everything. Since you cannot please everyone, you must first please yourself. That was a sensitive song. On the Billboard Hot 100, it peaked at number 6 and became a gold. Then Rick was back for a while. In over a decade, it was his first top 10 hit. It was short-lived, but fans who had dismissed him were suddenly singing along. Palace Guard was one of the unsuccessful follow-up singles. By 1974, his record label was unsure on how to handle him. Albums such as Windfall failed. He began performing in theme parks and small TV parts until being fired by the MCA. Garden Party ended up being both a triumph and a farewell. The golden boy of American pop was once Rick Nelson. However, his life was getting out of hand by the middle of the 1970s. Only appearances were keeping his marriage to Chris Nelson intact as it was collapsing. Rick was often traveling in an attempt to keep up with their opulent way of living. Luxurious mansions, private schools, and amount of debt. However, his distance grew as he worked more. Chris felt helpless. Rick was stuck. Their discussions descended into disputes, and the house they had constructed was transformed into a battleground. Rick expected warmth when he returned home in 1977 from yet another lengthy tour. On the contrary, he was barred out. When he arrived at the rental home where Chris had moved all of his possessions, she was there with 2 Los Angeles Rams cheerleaders. Was astonished and ashamed. It became evident at that time. There was no turning back now. Accusing Rick of drug use, Chris said she did it for the kids. Rick's group disputed everything, but the harm had already been done. Their union was irreparably ruined. They gave it another go in 1980. For $750,000, Rick purchased Errol Flynn's former Mulholland Drive estate, which was intended to be a new beginning. Chris insisted, however, that he give up music and pursue acting. Rick was unable. To make ends meet, he had to tour because he was drowning in debt. Peace was not brought by the mansion. Stress increased as a result. It was rumored to be haunted. The lights flickered, the family heard noises, and the money continued to run out. The house of dreams turned into a nightmare. Things got heated throughout the divorce. Rick was accused by Chris of abusing drugs and not being a good father. If she stayed, she warned, their children would perish. Accusing her of abusing alcohol and abandoning the children to the staff, Rick retaliated. 5 years passed throughout the judicial struggle. Lawyers alone cost more than $1 million. There was emotional destruction on both sides. And the kids found themselves in the center, seeing their parents' disintegration. It ended at the end of 1982. The separation was final. Rick was mandated to pay child support of $4,000. He had 4 children, ages 8 to 19, and he shared custody of them. He was literally broke, though. He had been exhausted by the court battle. He continued to tour night after night in order to make ends meet. Everything carried an emotional burden that never went away. His health deteriorated, his soul grew gloomy, and the joy he had experienced seemed to be lost forever. Rick really wanted to make a comeback by 1985, but there was a catch. He was a terrible flyer. However, he insisted on not using a tour bus, so he spent $118,000 for an old jet. It was a DC-3 Douglas from 1944. Jerry Lee Lewis had once owned it. Rick believed it would provide him with privacy and financial savings. It was a disaster, though. The engines weren't trustworthy. Parts frequently failed. The band also had to repeatedly push it off the runway. The plane frightened everyone. Bobby Neal's wife pleaded with him not to fly on it. 2 emergency landings had already been completed by bassist Patrick Woodward. Andy Chapin, the pianist, was also opposed to boarding. However, Rick disregarded every caution. He needed the cash. He was not able to cancel shows. He missed a huge opportunity in September due to an engine failure that prevented him from receiving farm help. The plane experienced another mechanical issue on December 31, 1985, which caused it to be delayed for hours. Nevertheless, Rick got on it. For a New Year's Eve performance, they were taking a plane to Dallas. Smoke invaded the cabin somewhere in Texas. The pilots were unable to see the instruments because of how dense it was. Brad Rank had to fly blind by sticking his head out the side window as the principal pilot. Just 2 kilometers from a landing strip close to DeKalb, the jet crashed in a field around 5:14 p.m. It was flying erratically and carrying black smoke, according to witnesses, until it struck some trees and burst into flames. The debris was dispersed across 150 yards. Only the pilots who managed to escape through the cockpit windows survived. Rick was among the 7 others that perished in the fire. Rick was just 45 years old. Along with 5 members of his band and crew, he was accompanied by his fiancée, Helen Blair. Bassist Patrick Woodward, drummer Rick Infeld, guitarist Bobby Neal, piano Andy Chapin, and sound specialist Donald Clark Russell. To identify the victims, police had to do autopsies because the collision was so horrifying. The music industry was astounded. Nelson was one of the most popular teenage idols in his era. And he was gone now, barely hours before 1986. It got even more confusing from there. Rick's financial situation was in ruins. He has 4 children, Matthew, Sam, Tracy, and Gunnar. He had divorced his wife, Christine Harmon. Despite being betrothed to Helen Blair, he abandoned her without his will. So were his mother and his ex-wife. Even worse, it was said that Rick's expenditures, court bills, and the upkeep of the vintage DC-3 that killed him had left the estate in debt by almost $1 million. People initially believed Rick had passed away without a will. According to his ex-wife, she moved to take over the estate because she was unable to locate one. However, a will that was made just 4 months prior to the collision was later provided by Rick's brother, David Nelson. That was the turning point. Only Rick's 4 children were listed as heirs in the will, and David was named executor. It was unclear, however, whether there would be anything left to inherit because of the numerous obligations. It wasn't taken lightly by Kristen. Despite their divorce, she made an attempt to collect a portion of Rick's life insurance. In court, she also contested David's executorship. Quickly, the court battle became acrimonious. Some of the accusations, which went back years, were financial irresponsibility, poor parenting, and drug usage. For the divorce alone, almost $1 million had already been spent. Lawyers were now scouting what was left. An even greater shock followed. Rick was the father of another son. Rick had a brief affair with a woman named Georgian Crew in 1980, which resulted in the birth of Eric Jude Crew. Rick initially denied being the father, but in 1981, a court-mandated blood test showed that he wasn't. He was mandated to pay $400 in child support each month, however it has been alleged that he eventually stopped making payments. Rick left Eric out of his will entirely and stated that paternity was contested. The court affirmed the will notwithstanding Georgian's battle for her son's portion of the inheritance after Rick's death. Eric did not receive anything. Helen Blair's parents simultaneously filed a wrongful death case. They requested compensation and said that the jet crash was caused by inadequate maintenance. The other passengers' families also joined in. There were other lawsuits. Creditors submitted claims. Georgian fought to protect Eric's rights. Kristen persisted in her struggle for insurance reimbursement. The estate had the appearance of a sinking ship with too many hands reaching for food crumbs. However, everyone was unaware that Rick's true wealth was not in real estate or money. He had it in his music. His royalties and catalog were worth a secret fortune, particularly from digital platforms like streaming. Its covert theft by record labels was the issue. The Nelson estate filed a lawsuit against Capitol Records in 2011 seeking $100 to $250 million. The lawsuit accused Capitol of underpaying Rick's estate on digital sales, concealing unmatched revenue, and claiming that the money couldn't be connected to any particular artists. Capitol had been making illogical deductions, such as applying breakage fees intended for vinyl or physical CDs to digital downloads. According to the estate, it was fraud. They were employing old accounting techniques to siphon off millions. Refused to supply all audit data as well. What was the outcome? The amount that Rick's heirs actually owed could not be confirmed. 2014 saw a settlement of the case. Better disclosure going forward was promised by Capitol, which also agreed to pay an undisclosed sum. The legal team referred to the triumph as historic. It wasn't the end, though. In 2020, Sony Music was acquired by the estate. This time, worldwide streaming was the subject of the case. Sony was accused of lowering compensation and lowering royalties by enforcing intercompany fees, which meant that Sony's own offices were charging one another. What was the outcome? Prior to the rise of Rick's inheritance, up to 68% of some revenues had been lost. The settlement was enormous. $12.7 million plus a future 36% rise in streaming royalties. Rick's children began to get actual income from their father's estate at last.